Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Boomer Buddies podcast, where we tell it like it was and is. I'm your host, Rick Reed. Today, I'm very happy to have a special friend I used to work with back in the day who knows a lot about municipalities and cities and populations. Today, I have my friend Mike Cronin joining us on my Boomer Buddies podcast. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Rick. Glad to be here.
All right, let's get started with, first of all, how we met. You are a baby boomer. You were born in 1946, so you're the first class
Yes,
of the Boomer Buddy
the edge.
era. When did we meet?
We met in 1985 when I came to work for Nagley Outdoor Advertising, and you were on the operations side. And I was hired to have the unenviable task of selling billboards to people that don't buy billboards. Basically, city council members, city staff, that type of people. My background for that was I worked for the city of Minneapolis for 13 years. During that time, I got to learn a lot about Minneapolis, talking to people at the city that had 30 years experience there, some of them who had been around all through the 50s, and some of them even prior to the Second World War. And in my job for the city, I had to learn about the city, how it worked, how it grew, and how it was changing. And so that's the basis for my interest in the city. Going to work for Nagley, I got out of the city of Minneapolis, obviously, and had a chance to learn about St. Paul and numerous other cities in the area, talk to planners and officials from those cities about their growth and how their city was changing, all the while trying to define a place for outdoor advertising in the city in the future.
Now, you had a very tough job. We all had challenges in our different areas in the outdoor
That's for sure.
advertising. I always admired what a great job you did. You're always well prepared. You're a very likable guy, so it's hard for anybody to say no to you, at least in a mean way.
It was easy to say no to me, believe me. But,
well, at our last lunch, for the listeners and viewers out there, we have lunch, every month, every other month, 4 or 5 of us get together and we talk about the old days. And the last lunch, Mike, you brought some information on population changes in the Twin City metro area, Minneapolis, St. Paul. And you talked about how it changed throughout our boomer lifetime. Now, I'm the kind of guy that I like to look at houses when I'm driving around, and I like to wonder what families lived there through the generations. And maybe we could start there. You could just talk about population changes in the Twin Cities, which is probably very similar to other large cities across the country,
so.
Right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think as we talk about population changes in the cities, the very easiest people to talk about are the rich people because there's not so many of them and their houses were very distinctive. In both Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's a concept of a prestige sector where every city has a prestige sector where the richer people live as opposed to the middle class and poorer people. And in Minneapolis and St. Paul, the prestige sector started out by going west up the hill. St. Paul went up to Summit Avenue and Crocus Hill, continued along Summit Avenue for a long time, but finally reached the river where it ran out of prestige sector. By that time, the rich people had flipped to move to White Bear and be James J. Hill's neighbors in North Oaks. This really weakened St. Paul in relation to Minneapolis. Minneapolis, the lumber guys, which were the first guys to have money in Minneapolis, went up the hill. Walker, Dunwoody, a number of people like that. Walker's home was where the Walker Art Center is now. He moved up into Lowry Hill. Lowry was his son-in-law who was involved in the streetcar system. He would buy a bunch of land and then run a streetcar out to it and then sell it and do quite well. That was the second fortune. By the time the flower guys came along, Lowry Hill was filled. So they started to move east along Ridgedale. And the flower guys most famously ended up at Washburn Fair Oaks Park at 24th and basically 3rd Avenue. Washburn and Crosby lived where the Art Institute is now, and across the park from them were their competitors across the river, the Pillsburys. They have 2 mansions there. And of course, the area around it filled in with bankers and lawyers and that kind of stuff. Continued east very, very gently to Portland and Park, where there are still a number of mansions, none of them occupied, I don't think, as mansions anymore. Most famously, John Coles, who's the owner of the Star and Tribune, lived on Portland Avenue. And then at some point, the publisher of a Swedish newspaper, I think his name was Sven Turnblad, built his new home on the corner of 26th and Portland. That became the Swedish Institute as we know it now. I think at that point, all the flower guys and their successors said, screw this, I'm not going to live with Swedes. And they began to move west. By that time, Lake of the Isles had been dredged out and formed by Theodore Worth, connected to Cedar Lake and to Lake Calhoun. And as they moved west, they found more and more hills, more and more areas until you get to Lake Minnetonka, of course. And that's where the best of all people live. So to my feeling is if you draw a line from uptown to Excelsior along Highway 7, that's kind of the major point of the prestige sector of Minneapolis, and it has held through a time because it just got better and better as you moved west.
And again, you can compare this to other cities
Yeah,
where the rich people had certain areas and then they
yeah.
expanded. We have a lot of listeners in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, upper Midwest, so they can relate to what Mike is talking about.
There was always a lot of flat land for people to expand onto. We talked very briefly in Minneapolis about the Swedes and about how they were so important, especially with the milling industry.
What is the most important change that you observed, especially during our boomer lifetime?
That change to me was the change in the role and the vision of the central city downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. When I was in high school, 50% of the population of the metro area and 63% of the jobs were in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis and St. Paul was where it's at. If you wanted to buy some clothes, you went downtown to get on the bus, or your parents drove you down to Dayton's in downtown Minneapolis, found a parking spot, and you did your shopping either there or at Donaldson's or Penny's or Powers or any of the other stores that were available in downtown. Also, 63% of the people worked in downtown Minneapolis or downtown St. Paul. These weren't just office jobs; they were jobs in breweries and making washing machines. 3M was still on East 7th and Arcade in St. Paul. A lot of people blue collar going to work in the area. That changed. So when I was in high school, there were 11 high schools in Minneapolis. There was no reason to go anywhere else but a different high school. The only reason why you might want to leave Minneapolis was to go to St. Louis Park for a McDonald's. We really weren't aware of the suburbs at all because there was just so much going on in Minneapolis, and that was the center of our life.
You're talking about 1963?
1960, yeah, the 60,
Yep,
the basic early 60s.
sure.
Right now, the world has changed completely. Only a quarter of the population of the metro area lives in Minneapolis or St. Paul. We are
Wow.
the minority, and only a third of the jobs are in Minneapolis or St. Paul. So there's been this just dispersion of population and jobs and energy. A lot of us have still got this, what's called a concentric ring theory of the metro area. It's like a bullseye where Minneapolis and St. Paul are at the center, and then there's a series of rings going out from it. And that's simply not correct. I think that the evolution of cities is represented by this chart. At the very beginning, we were just a bunch of nomads. We were following the habitat. It was from oasis to oasis, or following the reindeer, or following the seasons in the woods, and very much based on habitat, very small scale. About the time of Christ, we had started to move already into cities, mainly for religious reasons, but proximity became important in government. And then we moved in with the Industrial Revolution, especially into the area of the great cities that they figured out how to provide fresh water and sanitary sewers so people could live together. They created great subway systems and other transit systems, rail systems to keep people together and create a major central city. And these central places, of course, got their strength from proximity. That was really an important value in those days because people had to live close together to walk to work or to get to work or whatever else. The next phase, I think, started just after the Second World War. And that was the time when Minneapolis and St. Paul were still dominant. But at that time, the metro area had about 1 million people in it. By 1972, we doubled our population, but I think that we did it in the metro area in a new form because mobility was available in the range of the car. So we disconnected where we shop from where we work, from where we live. And I think people chose amenity over proximity. People could spread out. And I think this happened both where we lived. We went from a 5 county metropolitan area in 1970 to a 13 county metropolitan area now. We're spreading out across the area because we can drive. Our work has changed. In 1958, General Mills opened their new headquarters out in Golden Valley on what was then Highway 12 and County Road 18.
Which is just west of Minneapolis.
Yeah, now it's the intersection of 394 and Highway 169. That was the first of the big suburban offices, and it was a shock to the city of Minneapolis when a flower guy, which Minneapolis was based on, left the downtown. Pillsbury at that time also was talking about a suburban location in Eden Prairie, again, just on open land in those days. This scared downtown. For the first time, Minneapolis began to worry about saving downtown. We have continued to disperse our work. When I was on the Bloomington Chamber of Commerce, there was a rumor that Seagate, which was a spinoff of Control Data, which was of course formed in the Minneapolis and St. Paul, was thinking about moving across 76th Street into Edina. Bloomington didn't want to lose a business until we found out that our competition was Ireland and Singapore. And it just shows you the dispersion of what's going on. Seagate eventually landed in Shakopee, so that was not so bad. Shopping also changed. In 1956, Southdale opened. It was the first covered mall in the United States and a model of shopping that was going to follow. You no longer had to go downtown to go to Dayton's. You could go somewhere else, park free, and still enjoy a diversity of areas. I think this combination of losing both General Mills, the rumor of Pillsbury, and the concern about Southdale and Dayton's opening a branch outside of downtown that eventually led to the Nicollet Mall trying to save downtown Minneapolis and make it a strong area. Target came along after that, which was a big box. It began to change things even more and brought more shopping opportunities away from the downtown, even away from the interior malls. It was a different way to shop, a different way to merchandise. At one time, it was thought of as Dayton's downstairs on steroids, which it was. But we got to the big box. We then got to the Mall of America. And again, just all these areas that have just changed the way that we shop. So it's no longer important to do. I call these virtual cities because each person gets to create their own city by the way that they connect where they live and where they work and where they shop. So my wife and I can live in different virtual cities. And of course, the people that don't have the energy or the education or the opportunity to create their own city continue to live in the central cities of 1950.
Hey, Mike, what do we have here?
This is a chart that FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Organization, asked the Metro Council to prepare maybe 10 years ago. They wanted to know where people were in the metropolitan area, both at night, where they live, and in the daytime where they work. And you can see that as people moved out from these central cities, they didn't move out equally. If you can almost see a line that runs down vertically, north and south, between Minneapolis and St. Paul. A lot less activity on the east side than on the west side. The Minneapolis side of the metro area continues its dominance, which basically began in 1920 when Minneapolis passed St. Paul in population. And more people live in suburbs and in the cities on the west side. Same thing happens with jobs. As you can see, there's still jobs in St. Paul. You can see in Minneapolis, much stronger, the strong growth along the 494 edge that runs from basically Eagan up into Plymouth. There's a lot of jobs in that area. And people always talk about, well, is it, why the west side so much stronger than the east side, and they must be discriminating against the people on the east side? I think that, number one, in the Midwest, the western twin in the metro always outgrows the eastern twin. If you think of Duluth and Superior, Fargo and Moorhead, Grand Forks and East Grand Forks, and all the way down, even in St. Cloud, which also spans the river, the city itself, but most of the growth in St. Cloud is out west towards Waite Park, and that might just be a normal thing. But I think in Minneapolis, this pattern was set when the glaciers receded 10,000 years ago, and San Anthony Falls began its migration up the Mississippi River to its present point where it's been stabilized in downtown Minneapolis. So St. Paul's relationship with the river was one of access on the river. There was a break in the bluffs near Lower Town, which enabled people to get out of the river and up into St. Paul, into Lower Town, and eventually into Rice Park. And so St. Paul was focused on the river and on south on the river to St. Louis. Minneapolis had relationships to the river was power for sawing lumber and eventually milling flour. The Mill City Museum talks about its history as power, production, and promotion. And so you had the situation of the power gave room to mill flour. By production, they mean bringing the grain to Minneapolis, a great network of rail networks and relationships spread from Minneapolis out to western Minnesota, North and South Dakota. And this solidified Minneapolis as the anchor to all those rural communities. And the last thing that the museum points out was promotion. What they mean by that was in the 1900s, Pillsbury and General Mills were selling flour in Europe as well as throughout the United States. And they believe that that was the start of the advertising agency, which has been strong in Minneapolis all that same time. A shorter version of what I just said was that I think that the lumber guys harvested the forests and then they loaned the money to the flour guys who harvested the farmers. And then they got together and built the banks and the financial institutions, insurance companies that still dominate the skyline of Minneapolis. In any case, the metro area, it wasn't a pure concentric circle. It's very much biased to the west, but still is a place with no center. And I think that's been a hard thing for me, who I've been observing this closely for all these years. But I think a lot of boomers still have got this central city dominant vision of the Twin Cities. And if you're trying to give advice to people, it just doesn't do any good because that world is gone. You can't go back to that world that you mentally grew up in. That was your mental map of the Twin Cities as you were growing up. It's still with many of us.
What is this chart about?
This chart just shows the outward growth of the residents of the metropolitan area. In 1950, the Census Bureau defines a metropolitan area basically on links for commuting, where you live versus where the jobs are and what the connections are between those two places. The 7-county metropolitan area that we have in our minds is a statutory metropolitan area that was created in the 70s. In 1950, when we had a population of 1 million people, we were in 4 counties, Anoka, Hennepin, Dakota, and Ramsey. By 1960, this had grown 1 county, which is Washington, which is basically Woodbury, 3M moving out to Maplewood and into Stillwater. By 1980, we had grown to the counties around the statutory metropolitan area, as well into Wisconsin with St. Croix. And in 1990, it now reaches up into Sherburne County, which is St. Cloud, and Pierce County, which is another county in Wisconsin. So this is far from the Minneapolis that I knew when I was going to high school. And I mean, it really has just been an astounding growth. And I don't know how many people have the opportunity like I've had to basically visit all those counties on business. So it's been quite a ride. It still is hard for me to incorporate into my mind over what Minneapolis is and what Minneapolis could be and should be.
Well, me too, Mike. Even when we worked at Nagley Outdoor Advertising, there wasn't that many counties in the metro area because we had billboards in mainly in the downtowns, and then further west and north and south. We had to work hard to get new billboards, right? Along
Yeah,
with keeping the existing ones. And
yeah,
the advertisers more and more wanted to go out to where the population
sure.
was. So the 7-county metro area became the 12-county, 11-county, 12-county metro area. And on here, 1990, look at all these, you know.
And also, what we had was because of our legacy from the 1930s, we just had a ton of posters of billboards in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Yeah.
And, and many of them were in areas that they didn't necessarily want to advertise in. I think that was one of the big blows when the tobacco companies agreed to not use outdoor advertising any longer. They basically wanted to advertise to everybody, and all of a sudden, that big segment of our business at Nagley was taken away. I don't know if they've recovered yet or not, but a lot of those billboards were obsolete, and that was our legacy.
Yes, public service ads had to be
Yeah,
put on there because you don't want to leave empty, rusty looking billboards, right?
no,
So, as you pointed out in a slide, a lot of the people moved out of the city, out to the suburbs, but yet those billboards were still there. Unfortunately, a lot of them were not deemed to be wanted when advertisers would come into town and try to pick out some billboard. We we had to get clever about filling those spots.
that was one of the reasons why I developed that target sector pricing system where we sold billboards by sector and we could
Yep.
price them separately because we could try to get some money back as well as from the original cost, the higher costs in the suburbs for the leases. So that was kind of number one about how we think about the area that I've been thinking about all my life and observing and seeing the changes.
Mike, what else? What other population changes have you noticed about the Twin Cities, cities in general, and the metro areas across the country?
Well, in addition, as we've grown and changed where we live, the population has also changed and become much, much more diverse than I ever remember. The Minneapolis that I grew up in, I was born in Minneapolis and lived in Minneapolis all my life, has become much more diverse. And that Minneapolis that I grew up in was predominantly white. In 1950, in the city of Minneapolis, 98% of the people were white. There were only 5,400 non-white people living in Minneapolis. By 1960, when I was in high school, we were still 97% white. I think we had one or two black kids at West High School, which is incredible. That's the experience of a lot of people that are my age. They didn't have that many, unless they went to Central or South or North. They have very, very few black kids in their school. But that's because there were only about 10,000 non-white people living in Minneapolis, even in 1960. By 1970, that had doubled up to 26,000 people, about 94% still white. And by 1980, I was out of the University of Minnesota and starting my work career. It was still only 47,000 people that were non-white. So 88% of the population was still white. We still are a very white community. Minneapolis also got smaller. In 1950, there were only 51,718 people living in Minneapolis. Minneapolis thinks that they reached their top population of probably 534,000 people in 1953 or 1954. It's been gradually losing population since. By 1970, it was down to 434,000. By 1980, it was down to 370,000. So, I mean, it just was this big change of people leaving Minneapolis or not having as many kids. I think that was really the case. I mean, I grew up in a family of four. I think, it was typical on our block to have 3 or 4 kids.
Sure.
We also had the Catholic family, of course, that had 8 or 10 kids, and which helped boost the population. I think now it's back down to no kids or 1 or 2 kids, and that's what's really changing. The number of housing units hasn't changed that much in Minneapolis, but there's just fewer people living in it. More people are living by themselves or just one other partner, maybe 1 or 2 kids. You can see that in the school system too. The schools have just have people, just fewer and fewer kids going to school in Minneapolis. A lot of families move out as their kids get into school and leave other families behind. So what's happened is that by 2020, Minneapolis grew back to 430,000 people, but the non-white people were responsible for the growth and the maintenance of the energy of the city and the health of the city for that. But today, if you look at chart 4, you can see that Minneapolis is still dominant in population over St. Paul. But you can see that St. Paul is now very close to being a majority city. Minneapolis is at 60%, so it's still predominantly white, but still it's changed. The census has a special category for Hispanics or Latinos, and you can see that Minneapolis and St. Paul are about equal. I think that the Latino population saved East Lake Street. Minneapolis always had plans to improve East Lake Street. They saved East Lake Street, just like I think the Hmong have saved University Avenue in St. Paul. None of the planners saw that coming or ever talked about that in a plan. But if you look at just the people that the census considers of color, Black or African American, American Indian, Asian Pacific Islander, or other alone, or 2 or more races, you can see that the immigrants into the city and the minorities in the cities are becoming really, really important, especially in St. Paul with the Asian or Pacific Islanders, which are the Hmong, the total thing. I think the reason why I made this chart was because I was looking to see how many Somalis lived in Minneapolis. They aren't broken out as a special category, but they're estimated that there's about 90,000 Somalis in the state of Minnesota. 3/4 of them live in Minneapolis or St. Paul. I think a lot of those live in Minneapolis. So again, it's just a change that's kept us stable and growing. If you look at chart 5, this diversification of our population, I think is very easy to be invisible to baby boomers, especially baby boomers. We don't work downtown anymore. We don't work anywhere probably, but we don't work in downtown Minneapolis, so we don't see daily the changes that have occurred. We're very much still a very segregated community. And so baby boomers can avoid very, very easily ever coming in contact with majority Black areas because there's still so many white areas in the Twin Cities that you can see there. The next to last is on chart 6. This is a chart that was prepared by the Metropolitan Council, and it talked about 2000 to 2010, which was a very difficult time for the metropolitan area. This was prepared by the Metropolitan Council, and it just was a stunning chart to me. Between 2000 and 2010, 1 million people moved away from the 7-county metropolitan area, which is just incredible to me. There were more babies born than people died. But luckily, 980,000 people moved in. And I think that the people that moved in, some of them were from northern Minnesota, our traditional parts of where we get migrants from Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Wisconsin, northern Iowa. But I think a lot of the people that moved in didn't look much like the people that moved away. And I think that's just a big change that we went through during that time.
Mike, let me ask you something. Do all cities have people stick to their own kind? You know, like the Germans, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and over time, do they kind of integrate? Is that common? And in the Twin Cities, I know there are different areas of the city that had different neighborhoods with different heritages. Is that normal? And maybe you can give some insight on maybe Minneapolis, for example.
Well, I mean, that's something that I've thought about a lot, and I think that all communities there is affinities. If you look in Northeast Minneapolis, rather than parishes, the Catholics went by nationality,
Hmm.
which reason why there's 20 Catholic churches in Northeast Minneapolis, and there's four Catholic churches on a corner, which is incredible. I mean, you never see that anywhere else, and I think that is certainly an experience. I know Minneapolis more than I know St. Paul, or at that level of detail in other cities. But you can track things by the churches, by the grocery stores, by by the sense of that, the names of the businesses that are along the way, along Central Avenue, for example, in Northeast,
Hmm.
and it changed. And one of my favorite things is, and I think that you talk about the melting pot and about how people eventually, spread out and they intermarried. I mean, my Swedish Protestant mother married a Catholic Irish husband, and she scandalized half the neighborhood. It was just, I don't know whether it was the fact he was Irish or he was Catholic was the worst, but I mean, there are relatives that were really upset about that kind
Sure.
of stuff. And I think that basically holds those patterns. And you think about St. Paul, which is famous for its Catholic schools, and and as opposed to the public schools and the parishes, and rather than the neighborhoods. I mean, people still talk about St. Anne's Parish. They don't talk about the area south of Highland, and it's just people that's clearly there. And one of the strongest things was the disadvantaged, which in Minneapolis was the Jewish population and the black population. And like I said, there are very few blacks in 1950. There are only 5,500, but they mostly lived in one area because they were forced into that by a discrimination. They basically just lived north of downtown Minneapolis in the near North Community, especially area around Olson Highway and Lindale Avenue and on out from there. That was low lying land. It was hard to develop. It was a big floodplain. Massa Creek was the path of the Mississippi River at one time, so it was very soft ground. You couldn't build tall buildings. It was unstable soils. They gradually did it. It was also in the 30s. It was the first place that they put public housing in Minneapolis. You could trace at one time you could go from the 30s to the 40s to the 50s to the 60s to see the style of public housing that was built. And the public housing basically in Minnesota meant black people, or in Minneapolis meant black people. And I think the Jews had the houses first, and they were upland as you get up towards Penn. The land rises a little bit and gets a little bit better. And along Theodore Wirth Park at Plymouth, there were some wonderful houses that were built there, and that was where the more well-off Jews could buy a house and build it. They were rejected by deed restrictions and all kinds of things there, as well as Orthodox Jews had to walk to the synagogue. So that again was another thing that compressed their population. There are synagogues all over the north side, that you wouldn't expect. They're almost like Lutheran churches on the south side. But and you talk about there were Swedish Lutheran churches and German Lutheran churches and Norwegian Lutheran churches. So I mean, it's a crazy pattern to research, but I think that part of it was after the Second World War, a lot of people came back home. The Jewish baby boomers started, and they couldn't find housing in Minneapolis, and they went out to St. Louis Park, where a number of Jewish housing developers started to develop housing and sold it to Jews or whoever else wanted to live there. But that created that. Eventually, Bethel, which was the big synagogue on Plymouth and Penn, moved out to be by St. Margaret's. And again, that was just kind of the migration. I think that that the final step was the Martin Luther King riots in 1960, when there were some fires on Plymouth Avenue. The last of the Jewish merchants got burned out, and that left the blacks to continue to move up into the north side, into what was then called the Willard Homewood neighborhood. So, but at the same time they were moving south, I think that there always was a black population around the Milwaukee yards. There were the Pullman car waiters and people that were focused around the Milwaukee Railroad yards, Hiawatha and East Lake Street, with the congestion caused by building 35W, digging that big trench through South Minneapolis and all this disruption that caused. It allowed another black ghetto to begin to develop, moving out along that 6 block width area out into where Central High School was, which used to be mixed and now it became very black. And eventually they were able to move all the way up to like 48th in Chicago, and the Field Hale School experience, where they tried to merge two Minneapolis schools very early in their life. But it was a lot, I mean, I'm sorry, I can't. It's kind of off the cuff, but I mean, Rick,
Perfect.
things just keep changing. I mean, and there's a reason for everything. I mean, it really is. I mean, I think. I mean, I wander through Minneapolis, and I wonder the same thing. The advantage for me is I've had the opportunity to talk to people about it and know where to research it, and the interest to research. And but I mean, a lot of that stuff that I learned about the North Side was talking to city employees that lived through it in the 50s. That they were in the middle of their career, or talking to families, black and white, that had been affected by that and moved or didn't move, or moving on up in the world. So, about there's 8 million stories in the New York City or whatever, but I think that there's got to be just millions of stories in the metropolitan area of how people
Absolutely.
grow and did. And I'm sure things are going on in Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center and St. Louis Park now, and just the changes in people. Whoever was dominant is not anymore, or whoever has the money doesn't have the money anymore. And I mean, it's just really an incredible story of just ongoing recreating ourselves.
Time waits for no one, Mike.
That's for sure. And there's a great Chinese curse. It is, may you live in interesting times. And I think that we all
It,
do.
it is. It is.
So this chart prepared by the Minnesota State Population Demographic Center just shows you why we need the international migration to maintain the viability of the place. The gray charts are the rate of international migration not from the 90s. You can see in the 90s, it was less than the domestic net migration. You can see that in the year 2000, which was that decade we were just talking about, you can see it's now much more important. And you can see now by 2020, we are losing domestic migrants and gaining international migrants. And so while we still have birth over deaths going on, it just shows you that the net migration, even with the international people coming in, is still decreasing in Minnesota, and about how important it is to continue to attract. But I think the major lesson is boomers have to be very, very careful about giving people advice, because they look back on a world that just is gone and it can't be created again. And it's not helpful unless you can look forward. And so I think that the whole, wishing things would be like they were, which is a common and comforting thought, is not something that I think that we can count on in the future.
Well, population wise, yeah. I know that a lot of what we do on this platform is we talk about the old days. We talk about the old music, the old movies, things like that give us joy. And I mean, it's okay to think of the old days going downtown and shopping down there, just because it was different. We didn't have the big Mall of America. And it's nice to remember getting on the bus with my mom and going downtown. But you are correct, Mike. Things have changed, and we can't go back. We really can't. But we can wistfully look at it and
Yes,
remember
and I should
with
probably be
joy.
more wistful, but it was good to talk to you. I've enjoyed your podcast, talking to people. And it was fun to think about the old days at Nagley again. So,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can't go back, but it's fun to think about it and just know that your feet are in the now. And we're
mhm.
dealing with things as boomers now, like aging, right?
Mhm.
Dealing with health. You're fighting a cold right now, Mike. I thank you for coming
Yeah.
on. And what I want to do in the future when you come on, I want to talk with some of the guys we have lunch with. You've got Art Dean, Vietnam vet, interesting guy. You got Roger Nowitzki. He's still working. He's a little bit younger than us. And you got Tom Cleese, my favorite boss of all time.
Tom was the hero of mine at Nagley. He was like you said, I had a fairly unique job responsibility. Didn't really have a supervisor, didn't have anybody working for me, wasn't part of any one team. Tom reached out to me and welcomed me in. I remember at about 10 o'clock some mornings, we would go over to Perkins and have a cup of coffee and a blueberry muffin and talk about what we were doing and gossip and the gossip about the company. It was always welcome that he kind of put his arm around me and said, this guy's okay. And he's got a different job. So
you both had experiences similar growing up in the 60s. And I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s, really. And it's fun to talk to you guys and get your perspective on things. And I got to work with you and got to know you. And now we get to still hang out. And thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me and allowing me to talk about something that's been really important to me. Thank you.
You're welcome. If any of you listeners or viewers out there have any comments you want to make, you're watching on YouTube, put it down in the comments below and I'll make sure that Mike sees it if he doesn't look himself. And then also, if you want to email me at myboomerbuddies4 at gmail.com, I'd love to hear from you. And if you have any content ideas, share those as well. We do a lot on TV shows, movies, music, Vietnam, anything that interests boomers, we do. Mike came on and I felt like I was in class again at college. It was fun for me to actually look at stats and figures because I'm not really a numbers guy, but when I see it visually like you presented it, Mike, very helpful to me. Thanks for doing the hard work on that. For Mike Cronin, I'm Rick Reed, My Boomer Buddies podcast. Until next time, we'll see you around the block.
If you enjoy this podcast and are viewing on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button on your screen, and share it with your friends, and feel free to comment below. You can also hear us on Spotify and Buzzsprout. Feel free to email comments to myboomerbuddies4 at gmail.com.